The first Zorak plasma strike obliterated the entire western wing of the Global Xenological Research Center, turning decades of scientific collaboration into ash and twisted metal. Dr. Elena Rodriguez felt the heat wash over her through the reinforced blast doors of the underground server room, her fingers frozen mid-type on the keyboard. Marco Alvarez, her young research assistant, pressed his hand against the room's thermal-sensitive display. "They're using a frequency modulation we've never seen before," he muttered, his voice a mixture of terror and fascination. "It's not just a weapon. It's a complete information disruptor." Elena watched the real-time global communication feeds dissolve into static. Major cities were going dark one by one. Tokyo first, then New York. London disappeared in a cascade of digital noise that looked almost like a swarm of mechanical insects consuming data. The Zorak weren't just attacking physical infrastructure. They were systematically erasing humanity's ability to communicate, to organize, to resist. "They studied us," Elena whispered, pulling up the last fragments of intercepted alien communications. "Not just our technology, our social structures, our communication patterns." The alien language was a complex web of bioelectric pulses and quantum-entangled information streams. Most researchers would have been lost, but Elena had spent the last decade of her life understanding the impossible. Marco's hand trembled. How did they get past our orbital defenses? The early warning systems. Everything. His question hung in the air, unanswered. A distant explosion rocked the underground facility. Dust filtered through microscopic cracks in the reinforced concrete. Elena knew they had minutes, perhaps less. She began transferring critical research data, not just to backup servers, but using a custom-designed quantum encryption protocol she developed as a theoretical exercise years ago. "We're not going to die here," she told Marco, her voice steady. The young man looked at her, a mix of hope and disbelief in his eyes. Outside their secure room, the sounds of chaos grew. Military protocols, emergency broadcasts, the last gasps of a global defense network being systematically dismantled. But Elena noticed something odd in the cacophony. Brief, almost imperceptible moments of resistance. A military communications officer somewhere was manually overriding automated systems. A power grid technician was creating local microgrids to prevent total infrastructure collapse. Individuals acting with a speed and creativity that no centralized system could match. The Zorak had made a critical miscalculation. Marco suddenly pointed at a secondary monitor. A fragment of data was dancing across the screen, not in standard human communication protocols, but in something else. Something adaptive. "That's not our standard encryption," Marco said, leaning closer. "It's changing, evolving." Elena recognized it immediately. It was a communication pattern she'd theorized but never proven. A dynamic, self-modifying information transmission that could adapt faster than any attempt to intercept or decode it. Humanity's survival mechanism, encoded into its most fundamental communication strategy. The blast doors began to heat up. The Zorak were cutting through, methodical and relentless. Elena grabbed a small datapad and a custom-built quantum storage device. Years of research compressed into something smaller than a human thumb. "We need to move," she told Marco. "And we need to find others." Their escape route was a maintenance tunnel Elena had insisted on installing during the facility's construction, a decision her colleagues had mocked as paranoid. Now, it was their lifeline. As they moved through the dark, cramped passage, Elena's mind was already working. The Zorak believed they were conducting a standard genocidal campaign. Eliminate communication. Destroy infrastructure. Crush resistance before it could begin. But they didn't understand humanity's most powerful attribute, the ability to transform chaos into opportunity. The tunnel opened into a vast underground network, a remnant of Cold War-era infrastructure that most have forgotten. Here, in the forgotten spaces between civilization's visible layers, humanity's real resistance would begin. Elena looked at Marco. "We're not running," she said. "We're regrouping." Outside, the Zorak continued their systematic destruction, believing victory was already assured. They couldn't have been more wrong. The abandoned automotive factory on the outskirts of what was once Detroit stood as a testament to human resilience. Jack Chen moved between the massive industrial machines, each step calculated, each shadow a potential shield. The Zorak hunting parties moved differently now, more cautiously. They'd learned that humans were not the simple prey they initially believed. A hand signal from Maria Rodriguez, no relation to Elena, but equally determined, stopped Jack in his tracks. Her makeshift thermal imaging device, cobbled together from salvaged drone components and smartphone parts, detected a Zorak scout unit approaching from the northeast. 3 units, Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. Biomechanical composition. Looks like they're carrying heavy molecular disruptors. Jack's team was nothing like a traditional military unit. There was Carlos, a former high school chemistry teacher who now specialized in creating improvised electromagnetic weapons. Aisha, a quantum computing expert who could hack alien communication frequencies faster than the Zorak could adapt. And Liu, a retired civil engineer who understood structural vulnerabilities better than anyone. The scout unit moved with an almost liquid precision, their biometallic exoskeletons shifting like living mercury. To any other species, they would have appeared invincible. To Jack's team, they were a puzzle waiting to be solved. "Remember the Tokyo Protocol?" Jack murmured into their encrypted comm system. It was a reference to their first major breakthrough, a moment when they discovered that the Zorak's supposedly impenetrable communication network had critical vulnerabilities. During the initial days of the invasion, a group of Japanese network engineers had noticed something extraordinary. The Zorak's communication system, while advanced, followed predictable patterns. It was a hive-mind approach that prioritized efficiency over adaptability. In Tokyo, a small team had managed to introduce a cascading information virus that caused temporary paralysis in an entire Zorak strike force. Carlos pulled out a device that looked like a cross between a radio transmitter and a medical ECG machine. "Frequency modulation ready," he said. "We've got one shot at this." The plan was audacious. The Zorak believed they had completely dismantled human communication infrastructure. They didn't realize that humanity's communication was far more than just technological infrastructure. It was cultural, intuitive, almost organic. Maria's device suddenly went silent, a bad sign. Jack knew what that meant. The Zorak had developed a scanning technology that could detect electronic signatures. They were getting smarter, adapting. "Switch to manual," Jack commanded. Aisha pulled out a series of handcrafted signal boosters. Each one was unique, designed to mimic different types of electronic noise. To the Zorak scanning systems, they would look like random electromagnetic interference, nothing worth investigating. The scout units were closer now. Jack could see the intricate biological mechanisms that connected their exoskeletons. They weren't just wearing technology. They were technology. Living, thinking, interconnected machines that considered themselves the pinnacle of evolutionary design. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Carlos' device began to pulse, not with an electronic signal, but with a carefully constructed series of electromagnetic variations that mimicked natural planetary background radiation. To human eyes, it would look like nothing. To the Zorak, it was a carefully crafted invitation. The first scout unit paused, then another. Their collective consciousness was trying to parse the signal, to understand its origin and meaning. That moment of hesitation was all Jack's team needed. Liu had prepared their primary weapon, a modified industrial laser cutter, now reconfigured to emit a precise quantum-entangled frequency. As the Zorak scouts tried to process the electromagnetic noise, the laser cut through their communication network like a surgical blade. One by one, the scouts began to disconnect. Not destroyed, but confused, isolated. Their perfect, interconnected system suddenly felt the first true sensation of individual vulnerability. The underground network stretched beneath what was once the Canadian-American border, a labyrinth of repurposed infrastructure that defied the Zorak's most advanced scanning technologies. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood before a makeshift war room, a collection of salvaged monitors, quantum processors, and communication equipment that looked like a mad scientist's fever dream. "We're not just building a resistance," she told the assembled group. "We're creating an entirely new form of human organization." The room was a testament to humanity's diversity and ingenuity. Sitting around a circular table were individuals who would have never crossed paths in the old world. Kwame Osai, a Ghanaian electrical engineer who once worked on satellite communication networks. Mai Lin, a Chinese-Canadian biotechnology researcher. Diego Ramirez, a former Mexican Special Forces operator. Sarah Goldstein, a Israeli cybersecurity expert. And Marco, Elena's young assistant, now transformed from a research aide to a critical intelligence analyst. Their current mission was audacious: to create a communication network that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. "Traditional hierarchies are dead," Kwame explained, pointing to a holographic display that looked more like a living, breathing ecosystem than a communication diagram. "The Zorak expects centralized command structures. We're building something organic, adaptive, almost like a biological neural network." Mai Lin had been working on the most critical component, a method to encrypt and transmit data that mimicked biological communication patterns. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source: studying how slime molds communicate and solve complex problems. "Look," she said, bringing up a complex visualization. "Each transmission point acts like a cellular organism. It can receive, process, and redistribute information, but it doesn't have a fixed identity. The moment a node is compromised, it can completely restructure itself." Diego leaned forward, his military background evident in every calculated movement. "How does this protect against Zorak infiltration?" Sarah's fingers danced across a holographic keyboard. "Watch this," she said. A simulation began to play out, a Zorak tracking algorithm attempting to trace a communication pathway. But instead of a linear route, the data moved like a swarm of insects, splitting, merging, changing direction instantaneously. "They can't predict what doesn't have a predictable pattern," Marco added, a note of excitement in his voice. The room fell silent as Elena brought up their most recent intelligence gathering. The Zorak were beginning to realize that their initial assessment of humanity was fundamentally flawed. What they had considered a simple, hierarchical species was proving to be something far more complex. "We're not just fighting," Elena said quietly. "We're proving something fundamental about intelligence itself." Outside the underground facility, the world looked broken. Cities reduced to rubble, landscapes scarred by alien technology. But inside this network, something extraordinary was happening. Every survivor, every small pocket of resistance, was becoming a node in a living, breathing system of survival. Kwame pulled up a global map. Each point of light represented a communication node, some as large as a repurposed data center, others as small as a modified smartphone. "We've got coverage in 87% of the remaining habitable zones," he reported. "And the network grows more robust with each passing hour." Diego's tactical mind was already several steps ahead. "This isn't just about communication. This is a distribution system for everything: intelligence, resources, tactical information." Sarah showed them the latest encryption protocols. They weren't just complex, they were alive, constantly changing, learning, adapting. A communication system that was more of an organism than a technology. "The Zorak believe in perfect, unchanging systems," Mai Lin observed. "We're creating something that embraces chaos as a feature, not a bug." Marco caught Elena's eye. The transformation was complete. They were no longer just surviving. They were evolving. As if to punctuate the moment, their communication network suddenly lit up with a burst of activity. Multiple nodes simultaneously reported Zorak movement patterns, tactical vulnerabilities, potential resource locations. They weren't just resisting anymore. They were preparing to fight back. Elena looked around the room. This was humanity's true weapon, not any single piece of technology, but the ability to transform, to adapt, to become something entirely unexpected. The Zorak had no idea what was coming. The pain was unlike anything Elena Rodriguez had ever experienced. Her body burned from the inside, neural pathways rewriting themselves with each passing second. The viral vector she developed wasn't just a weapon. It was a fundamental reimagining of biological information transfer. Vital signs are stable. Marco's voice came from somewhere distant. But nothing about this is normal. The lab was a converted nuclear bunker deep beneath the Canadian Rocky Mountains, walls lined with quantum processors, biological containment units, and equipment that looked like a hybrid between a medical facility and an alien spacecraft. Elena had always known her research would push boundaries, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Her latest experiment was more than a potential weapon against the Zorak. It was a proof of concept about human adaptability that would change everything. The viral vector targeted the fundamental communication mechanism of biological systems, not just in humans, but in the Zorak's own biotechnological infrastructure. It wasn't about destruction. It was about conversion, about finding a way to communicate across what seemed like an impossible divide. The genetic markers are stable, Madeline reported, her fingers dancing across multiple holographic displays. But Elena, this is pushing the boundaries of what we understand about genetic communication. Jack Chen stood in the corner, his tactical mind constantly assessing risks. The former Special Forces operator had become more than just a military strategist. He was now a critical bridge between scientific innovation and practical application. "Walk me through it again," he said, his voice steady. Maylin pulled up a complex visualization. Traditional viral vectors work by introducing foreign genetic material. What Elena's developed is something entirely different. It's a communication protocol that can rewrite how biological systems interpret information. The sample before them was both terrifying and beautiful. Under a quantum microscope, the viral vector looked like a living, breathing entity. It didn't just carry information. It negotiated with biological systems, finding common ground where none seemed to exist. Elena's transformation was the first test. Her body was becoming a living proof of concept. The Zorak see biological systems as perfect, unchanging machines, she muttered, her voice slightly distorted. But biology is about adaptation, about conversation. Marco watched the monitors carefully. Elena had always been brilliant, but now she was becoming something more. Her neural pathways were creating connections that defied traditional understanding of human biology. Jack recognized the tactical implications immediately. "This isn't just a weapon," he said quietly. "This is a complete reimagining of biological warfare." The viral vector worked on multiple levels. It could disrupt the Zorak's communication systems, yes, but more importantly, it could potentially create a bridge of understanding, a way to communicate with a species that seemed fundamentally incompatible with human existence. "We're not trying to destroy," Elena said, her words more clear now. "We're trying to translate." Mei Lin brought up comparative genetic models. The similarities between human and Zorak biological systems were more profound than anyone had initially understood. They weren't entirely alien, just fundamentally different in how they processed information. "Look at this," she said, highlighting specific genetic markers. The Zorak believed their biological technology was perfect, but perfection is static. We're showing them that true intelligence is about adaptation. Elena's body began to stabilize. The initial pain subsided, replaced by something else. A heightened awareness, a sense of connection that went beyond traditional human perception. "I can feel them," she whispered. "Not their thoughts, but their communication patterns." Jack and Marco exchanged a look. This was far beyond their original mission of resistance. They were exploring the very nature of intelligence itself. The viral vector was more than a weapon. It was a potential Rosetta Stone for interspecies communication. Outside the bunker, the world remained a battlefield. The Zorak continued their systematic destruction, believing they understood everything about their human opponents. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Elena opened her eyes. For the first time, she saw the world not as a collection of separate systems, but as a complex, interconnected network of information. "We're ready," she said simply. The first Zorak command ship began to fail in a way no one had predicted. It wasn't destruction, it was transformation. Jack Chen watched from a repurposed deep-sea research vessel, converted into a mobile command center. The ship's advanced holographic displays showed the Zorak vessel's biomechanical structure breaking down, not in violent disintegration, but in a cascade of adaptive reconfiguration. "It's Elena's viral vector," Aisha confirmed, her fingers dancing across quantum communication interfaces. "But this is beyond our initial projections." The vessel that had once been a symbol of alien technological superiority was now becoming something entirely new. Biological systems that had been rigidly structured began to shift, to breathe, to reconfigure. It was less an attack and more a radical form of communication. Carlos, the former high school chemistry teacher, leaned forward. "Those aren't just system failures," he muttered. "That's negotiation on a molecular level." The Resistance had learned that the Zorak were not a monolithic entity, but a complex biological network. Their ships were not machines, but living organisms, and organisms could be spoken to, could be understood. Maria Rodriguez brought up a series of data streams. "We're detecting multiple internal conflicts within the Zorak network," she reported. "It's like the viral vector is creating internal dialogue where none existed before." Jack understood the tactical implications immediately. The Zorak's greatest strength had always been their perfect, unified communication. Now that very system was becoming a vulnerability. "They've never experienced individual thought," he said quietly. "We're introducing them to the concept of disagreement." The command ship began to emit a series of complex electromagnetic pulses. To any other species, it would have looked like system failure. To the human Resistance, it was something far more profound, a conversation. Malin's latest research suggested that the viral vector wasn't just disrupting the Zorak systems. It was teaching them a fundamentally different way of processing information. The rigid, hierarchical communication they'd relied on was being replaced by something more dynamic, more adaptive. "Look at this," she said, highlighting a series of molecular interactions. "It's like we're introducing the concept of individual agency to a collective that's never experienced it." The ship's external structure began to change. Biomechanical components that had been perfectly aligned now moved with a new kind of uncertainty. It was beautiful and terrifying. A living system learning to think differently in real time. "We're not destroying them." Elena's voice came through the communication channel, still recovering from her viral vector transformation. "We're giving them a choice." Below decks, a team of specialists monitored every microscopic change. Diego Ramirez, the former Special Forces operator, had become their primary xenobiological interpreter. He understood that this wasn't just a military engagement, it was first contact in its truest sense. "They're experiencing something like individual consciousness for the first time," he reported. "Can you imagine living your entire existence as a single unified thought, and then suddenly experiencing individual perception?" The Resistance had discovered something profound about the Zorak. Their technological superiority was built on a fundamental limitation, a complete absence of individual thought. Their ships, their weapons, their entire civilization functioned like a single massive organism with no concept of individual agency. Jack watched as the first Zorak command ship began to broadcast, not in their previous unified communication method, but in something fragmented, uncertain, almost curious. "We're receiving multiple communication streams," Aisha reported, her voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "They're not coordinated. They're arguing with each other." The tactical implications were enormous. A civilization that had never experienced internal dialogue was suddenly confronting the possibility of individual thought. One of the holographic displays suddenly filled with a complex biological pattern that looked almost like a question mark. Alina's laugh came through the communication channel. "First contact," she said simply. The ship continued to change, not destroyed, not conquered, but fundamentally transformed. Outside, other Zorak vessels began to show similar patterns of reconfiguration. The invasion was becoming something else entirely, a conversation. Jack Chen looked at his team. They were no longer just a resistance. They were becoming something more. First contact was happening, and humanity was rewriting the rules. The Zorak Primarch, a being that had never known individual thought, now experienced something terrifyingly new: doubt. Deep within the central consciousness matrix of their primary command vessel, psychological fractures began to spread like hairline cracks in a perfect mirror. Sarah Goldstein watched the real-time visualization, her fingers dancing across a holographic interface that looked more like a living neural network than any traditional computer system. "It's not just breaking their communication," she muttered to Jack Chen. "We're fundamentally altering their perception of reality." The psychological warfare was Alina's most brilliant creation yet. The viral vector had done more than introduce individual thought. It had weaponized uncertainty. Each Zorak communication node now carried a subtle payload of cognitive dissonance, complex algorithmic packages that introduced microscopic variations in their collective thinking, questions where there had once been only absolute statements, possibilities where there had been only certainties. Quamosi brought up a series of intercepted communication streams. "Listen to this," he said, highlighting a particularly fascinating transmission. The Zorak communication sounded like a chorus suddenly encountering individual voices, fragments of dialogue that betrayed growing internal conflict. QUER. Is conquest the only path? Contradiction, HETCTED. Previous understanding compromised. Untensi or teing. Towai. Maximum toali or nc exceeded. Diego Ramirez understood the tactical brilliance immediately. "We're not just fighting them," he explained to the team. "We're teaching them how to think differently." The human resistance had discovered the Zorak's most critical vulnerability: their inability to process individual perspective. Their entire civilization was built on a perfect, unified consciousness that had never experienced doubt, never encountered the concept of individual agency. Maylin's research had revealed something profound. The Zorak weren't just a technological species. They were a single, massive biological network that had never experienced individual thought. Their ships, their weapons, their entire civilization functioned like a single organism with no concept of personal identity. "Imagine living your entire existence as a single thought," Alina said, her body still recovering from the viral vector transformation, and then suddenly discovering that thoughts can disagree. The psychological attack was multifaceted. Communications intercepted by the resistance showed the Zorak's collective consciousness beginning to fragment. Where once there had been perfect unity, now there were questions, uncertainties, the first trembling hints of individual perspective. Marco brought up a series of visualizations showing the spreading cognitive disruption. "It's like introducing a virus of individual thought," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. Jack understood the deeper strategy. This wasn't about destruction. This was about liberation. Sarah's communication systems began picking up increasingly fragmented Zorak transmissions. What had once been a perfect, unified communication network now sounded like a massive argument happening simultaneously across multiple dimensional frequencies. QUERY. Y. Communiquest. Commentated. Howdy. Try. Previous understanding, ANVALID. TOSSIVIL. ALTRNATE. EXAD. The Zorak had never encountered the human concept of philosophical uncertainty. Their entire civilization was built on absolute statements, on perfect unity. Now they were experiencing something entirely new, the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of individual thought. Quaim highlighted a particularly fascinating transmission. "They're literally arguing with themselves," he said, a mixture of scientific fascination and dark humor in his voice. The Resistance had weaponized something more powerful than any physical weapon, the concept of individual perspective. Diego walked them through the tactical implications. "Every moment of uncertainty is a moment they can't coordinate an attack," he explained. "We're turning their greatest strength, their unified consciousness, into their most critical weakness." Alina's viral vector had done more than disrupt their systems. It had introduced a fundamental philosophical revolution. The Zorak command ships began to drift. Not destroyed, not defeated, but fundamentally transformed. They were learning to think. Jack Chen looked at his team. They were no longer just a resistance. They were architects of a new form of first contact. "We're not just fighting," Alina said quietly. "We're teaching." Outside, the stars watched. And for the first time, the Zorak were beginning to look back, not as a unified consciousness, but as individuals discovering the terrifying, beautiful possibility of individual thought. The final assault was nothing like traditional warfare. Jack Chen stood on the bridge of the modified research vessel, now a mobile command center that looked more like a living organism than a military platform. Around him, the Resistance team moved with a precision that defied conventional military training. They were no longer just soldiers. They were translators, negotiators, architects of a completely new form of conflict resolution. "Incoming Zorak fleet," Maria Rodriguez reported, her voice calm. "But something's different." The holographic displays showed the approaching Zorak ships, once a perfect, uniform mass of technological might, now a chaotic tapestry of individual vessels making independent decisions. Some moved aggressively, others hesitated. A few appeared to be communicating with each other in ways that suggested something closer to argument than coordination. Alina, still recovering from her viral vector transformation, watched the displays with a mixture of scientific fascination and strategic calculation. "They're experiencing individual consciousness for the first time," she said quietly, "and they have no idea how to handle it." Mai Lin brought up a complex visualization of the approaching fleet. "Look at the communication patterns," she said. "They're fragmenting, arguing. Some vessels are actively opposing others." Diego Ramirez, the tactical specialist, recognized the opportunity immediately. "Their unified strength was always their greatest weapon," he explained. "Now, it's becoming their most critical vulnerability." The Resistance had prepared for this moment through months of careful psychological intervention. The viral vector wasn't just a biological weapon. It was a philosophical intervention. They had introduced the Zorak to the concept of individual thought, and now they were watching the consequences unfold. "We're not here to destroy," Jack reminded the team. "We're here to transform." Quaim Osei's communication systems began picking up increasingly fragmented Zorak transmissions. What had once been a perfect, unified communication network now sounded like a massive multidimensional argument. QUERO. Purpose of invasion. Co-enturated. Chudlai. Previous understanding. ANVALID. TOSSIDILITE. All TRNATVEXISS. Sarah Goldstein monitored the psychological disruption. "Their entire civilization is experiencing its first existential crisis," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. The approaching fleet was a living demonstration of cognitive breakdown. Some vessels moved with aggressive intent, while others seemed to be actively resisting their own attack. It was less a military formation and more a massive three-dimensional argument happening across millions of kilometers of space. Marco, who had grown from a research assistant to a critical strategic analyst, brought up a series of predictive models. "They're losing their ability to act as a unified force," he reported. "Every moment of individual thought is a moment they can't coordinate an attack." Alina approached the main display, her body still showing traces of the viral vector's transformation. She looked less like a human scientist and more like a bridge between species. "We're not destroying them," she said quietly. "We're helping them evolve." The first wave of Zorak vessels began to break formation, not retreating, but arguing, communicating, experiencing something closer to individual agency than they had ever known. Jack recognized the tactical and philosophical implications immediately. This wasn't a battle. This was a birth. "All systems," he commanded, "prepare for Communication Protocol Alpha." The Resistance had developed a sophisticated communication matrix designed to facilitate understanding rather than conflict. It wasn't a weapon. It was a translation device. Mylin's systems began broadcasting a complex series of quantum-encoded messages, mathematical proofs, philosophical inquiries, fundamental questions about existence, consciousness, and potential. The Zorak fleet continued to approach, but their movement was no longer unified. Some vessels moved aggressively, others held back. A few seemed almost curious. "They're learning to think," Diego observed, "right in front of our eyes." Alina watched the displays, a subtle smile crossing her face. "First contact," she whispered. The space between human and Zorak vessels became a canvas of possibility. No longer a battlefield, but a meeting ground of consciousness. Humanity's greatest weapon had never been technology. It had been understanding. 5 years after first contact, humanity stood transformed. The first interstellar vessel gleamed against the backdrop of a rebuilt Earth, a hybrid creation that was neither purely human technology nor Zorak biological engineering, but something entirely new. Dr. Elena Rodriguez walked through its living corridors, her body still subtly changed by the viral vector that had started everything. "We're not just exploring," she told the assembled crew. "We're continuing a conversation." The vessel was a testament to collaborative evolution. Its systems breathed and thought, responding to human intention with a fluidity that would have seemed impossible before the invasion. Sections of the ship responded like living organisms, while others maintained precise mechanical functionality, a perfect metaphor for the new human Zorak understanding. Jack Chen stood at the navigation interface, if interface was even the right word anymore. His hands moved through holographic projections that responded like living thought, a seamless integration of human intuition and advanced technological consciousness. "Incoming communication," Maria Rodriguez announced. Her voice carried a note of excitement that spoke to something more than professional interest. The communication came not through traditional channels, but as a complex quantum entanglement of thought and intention. Fragments of collective and individual consciousness merged and separated, a dance of communication that defied traditional language. Marco, now a senior xenocultural specialist, began to translate. "It's a greeting," he said, "but it's also an invitation, an exploration, a question." The Zorak they had first encountered were gone, transformed by the very process of individual awakening that humanity had introduced. What remained was something hybrid, a new form of collective consciousness that celebrated individual perspective. Mei Lin approached the main display, her fingers moving in complex patterns that were part scientific notation, part artistic expression. "Look at the communication structure," she said. "It's evolved. No longer a hierarchy, but a network, a conversation." The ship's internal systems responded to the incoming communication. Corridors shifted, molecular structures realigned. It was less a technological response and more a form of dialogue. Sarah Goldstein monitored the quantum communication streams. "They're sharing something," she reported. "Not just information. Experiences, perspectives." Diego Ramirez watched the tactical displays, though tactical had become a quaint term for what was happening. The space between human and Zorak territories was no longer a battlefield. It was a meeting ground, a space of perpetual discovery. Quamosi brought up a historical comparison. "We didn't defeat them," he said quietly. "We invited them to become something more." The viral vector that Elena had developed had done more than disrupt the Zorak. It had introduced them to the most fundamentally human concept, the beauty of individual perspective within a larger collective understanding. Elena reflected on the journey. What had begun as a desperate resistance had become something far more profound. Humanity had not conquered the Zorak. They had helped them evolve. The ship's systems pulsed with a combination of biological and technological rhythms. Human crew members moved in harmony with systems that were part machine, part living organism. The boundaries between technology, biology, and consciousness had become beautifully blurred. Preparing for quantum jump, Jack announced, but it wasn't a military command. It was an invitation, the continuation of the conversation that had begun with humanity's first defiant resistance. Marco approached Elena. "We're not just exploring space," he said. "We're exploring consciousness itself." The first interstellar vessel moved with a grace that was neither mechanical nor biological. It was something new, something that celebrated the very concept of possibility. Outside, the stars watched, witnesses to a transformation that had begun with humanity's most fundamental strength. Not technology, not weapons, but the ability to understand, to communicate, to see potential where others saw only conflict. Elena looked out at the infinite expanse. Humanity had discovered something far more important than victory. They had learned how to truly connect. The vessel jumped, not into empty space, but into a conversation that was just beginning.